hopefully we can have a good discussion. Oh, thank you, Sue. Sue started recording. Um, and so the intent of this, and we really wanted to have this in person, but I know everybody's schedules were a little bit crazy, so we couldn't do it. The intent of this is just to go over the big picture items of this big AO, try and get a grasp on it and address any questions. I think I'm also going to recommend that we maybe have another work session immediately prior to the meeting on March 3rd, just so going into it, everybody has an idea of what they want to talk about or what questions they want. So all the municipal staff here, I think, are here to answer questions. There were a lot of issues we kind of worked through, and there were a lot of compromises in there among departments. So I want to encourage anybody to, if bring anything up. If you have a point of contention or you want to discuss something more, let's talk about it. This is a great time to do it. I think I'm going to go through the slides, and then maybe we'll do questions at the end. So if you have something, just write it down and note it. And then once we've gone through everything, we'll come back to it. So I think we'll take a break in about 50 minutes or 55 minutes or so, probably 10 minutes just to take a break, and then we'll do questions at the end. And we are recording this. Melissa, did you have anything else you wanted to add?
No, thank you. Okay,
cool. So I will just kick it off then. And again, if you have any questions, write them down and we'll get them at the end. And feel free. We really wanted this to be as sort of no dumb questions. This is a really complicated topic, so even it's like that doesn't make sense. Any recommendations would be great. Any suggestions, any comments. This is the time to bring those up. So I'll kick it off. So site access, again, please write down your questions. What is site access? The term, Andre had a question.
Well,
the rule.
I wanted to, just for the commissioners that are on the call, I guess I wanted to start, and I don't know what you said before I got here, but I wanted to introduce the issue, as this is something that came to kind of me and Tyler's attention a year ago when the code took effect, and has been a major problem ever since. And then I don't know if you also mentioned that there's been a large working group of us that have all worked on what's kind of shaped up to where we are today. So I guess I wanted the commission to kind of know that before we started.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, and we'll go over a quick sort of chronology of how we got to where we are in the working group. This was a pretty interesting project because we had a pretty big working group that met a number of times to look at it. So there were a lot of eyes that went into this. And I think most people felt it was a pretty successful process. So yeah, I will detail that. So first of all, big overview, what is site access? It's, in the most general terms, it's just how you get to and from a site, how you get from the public right-of-way, the public street, to a site on private property. So that's everything with driveway widths, the path to the front door, whether you access the building at the front of the building or the back of the building, whether you access from a street or an alley, what the building looks like, how the building, windows interact with the street and people walking by, and that sort of thing. And it's a complicated concept, and it touches a whole range of things. And this is really it's been a discussion for about 4 years now of trying to figure out how we manage all these various pieces of how people move vehicles on private property, how they connect to the public property in the street, how pedestrians walking by are or not at risk from people coming out of driveways and that sort of thing. So it's hard to describe in one word, but I think this is sort of an overview of what we're looking at. Really, it's the interface between public property and private property. So timeline of events. This project really kind of goes back to 2021 when there was a big project in the planning department to look at site access and parking, and it was sort of setting up a framework where parking mandates could be reduced or lessened in exchange for changes you do to your facade or your frontage or anything like that. Then, of course, in September 2022, the Assembly came up with a new version to that ordinance, and they just removed parking mandates altogether. And that sort of changed the linkage between what the standards were going to be and how they were going to be applied and what the sort of trading would be. So in July 2023, we came back with another ordinance that sort of brought back some of those frontage standards and maneuverability standards, and those went into effect in January 2024. Now, as soon as they went into effect, there was a lot of feedback that they were causing problems and people couldn't develop anything. So by April 2024, the Assembly passed a moratorium and they said, these are not in effect until November 2025. And at that point, they also said, put a working group together, figure this out, and we want some answers by early 2025, which is where we are now. So the working group started in earnest, I think, in late summer 2024, and we had our last meeting last month. I think we had about 5 meetings.
Daniel, can I jump in and clarify something really quick?
Yes, please.
Can we go back to the previous slide? I just wanted to clarify that when the Assembly passed a moratorium on the design on the site access standards, they only paused some of them. And then recently, this latest one this year was the one that imposed a moratorium on all of the site access standards.
Yeah, so it is. The site access ship has been moving since last year, and the design standard moratorium is sort of a speedboat that came up and passed in front of the other ship. So there's a little bit of overlap there, but even if this passes now, some of them will still be under the moratorium. Or the Assembly can decide and say, no, we want these to be in place and not those in place. But I think everybody in the working group sort of generally agreed we should keep pushing forward with these. We've done a lot of work and we think we've solved a bunch of problems for when the moratorium does go away. If it goes away, we've at least provided some code that can address some of those problems that were previously identified. So again, what was the original intent? It's a long time ago now, but believe it or not, things are actually more complicated in code, probably 5 or 6 years ago. There was a bunch of different stuff about how wide a driveway should be, how you can turn around on a site, how you interact with the street, what the alley requirement rules are. And so part of the original site access was dealing with that. But as I also mentioned, it's also tied up in sort of the reductions of parking, give you a trade to get some, a different allowance here or this or that. So that was sort of the original intent. You can find all this if you go back to, you just search Municipality of Anchorage Site Access Project. There's a whole page that has all the history of this and all the previous materials, most of which went through the Planning and Zoning Commission as well. So one thing that the original site access did is it created the urban context standards, the neighborhood context standards, which is these sort of overlays within which there was a different set of standards that applied in terms of frontages, how wide your driveway could be, where the parking could be. And this is something that caused a lot of friction, I think, in development. It was a little bit complicated, it was hard to understand, and it also created this new sort of mapped area that where the geographic boundaries were sort of unique to this project. And here's an example. These are the standards that applied inside those areas. So inside the purple, that was this standard, and then outside was this other standard. So this talks about how many windows you need to have, how wide your garage can be, the maximum projection your garage can make, how many windows you need on the building, on both sides of the building, the number of pedestrian amenities, and that sort of thing. So it was pretty complicated. So as I mentioned, the Assembly directed the Planning Department and basically the whole community to put together a working group. And so we convened a working group. It was design professionals, policymakers, developers, community members, Planning Department, to really figure this out. So we had 5 working group meetings between October 15th and January 14th, convened by Huddle, AK. So Huddle brought us all together. They did a great job in keeping us on track and really sort of helping us distill these difficult issues. And at least in my experience, the working group was great. We had it produced so many conversations, and it just shows how so much of this stuff touches so many other things. Another important piece of the working group was 2 site visits, one in November and one in December. So one, we went down to South Anchorage and we looked at sort of the Independence Park area, sort of master plan area, and also some of the older development there. Another place, there's an alley development down there. And then the second site visit, we walked around Spinard, and Cook Inlet showed us some of their properties and explained some of the challenges they faced. So thanks to Tyler for that. And I think all of us getting out there and everybody hearing what the concerns were, what the interests were, was really, really helpful. And just having everybody there walking around in the cold together was great. So the main topics of the working group of all the meetings with alleys, driveways, on-site parking location, pedestrian connectivity, pedestrian amenities, and the pedestrian frontage standard, which is how the building should look. And also the bigger question of, well, how does the building look relate to how people move on the street or get to the building? So all of that was included. Here was an example of us in the working group. you know, I think we had about 1 or 2 hours every time, and it was great to actually see and hear from, well, here was the challenge with this development, and hear another person say, well, I would have done it this way. Here was somebody from the community say, well, I like this or I don't like this. It was really productive, and I think we all got a lot out of it. This was another one here. We were on 36th. So these are the new townhouses, really nice townhouses that Cook Inlet built on 36th. But there were some challenges with them, right? And a lot of what they built there had been impacted by design standards and some other things. So it was really useful to get some practical information on that. And I gotta say, maybe I'm just saying this too much, but I thought it was a really good experience, and I think most of us had a lot of really good conversations. Because it was a lot of different people working on a lot of different things with a lot of different sort of perspectives, but I think we all got a lot out of it, and I think hopefully there will be some really enduring collaboration there. So let's define the problem. As we did this working group in the planning department, we're trying to figure out what to do next. The first thing we really settled on is like, well, we have to understand what problem are we trying to solve here. And really it's about again, I've said this, the interface between public and private, but also how much space is devoted to vehicles or moving vehicles, and how much space is devoted to other uses. So a lot of it in a lot of Anchorage is areas like this. And if you look at this, there's no real definition between the private realm and the public realm. And it's really hard to tell where the street or the right-of-way begins and the private property or parking lot begins. And so because of that, it's a really sort of unsafe environment. If you're walking through here, you don't know, is a car going to come this way or that way? And it really could. I mean, there are so many potential conflict points in an environment like this, not only for walking or biking or anybody, but even if you're driving, right? You have no idea, basically at any point, anything could come from anywhere. And this makes a pretty unsafe environment. And that's not even talking about aesthetics, right? Aesthetics was factored in a lot of these discussions, but this is an environment that many people have voiced opinions that is not very aesthetically pleasing. But there's also this major safety element as well. This, I think, is what most people imagine is a more idealized version of what the streetscape should look like, what that interface between public and private should look like. So compare here where you have basically undefined space all over. Here you have pretty well-defined space, right? You know what the driving area or the moving area within the right-of-way is, and you know where sort of access points are. So here you only have about 3 within this view. You only see 3 points where you might have some sort of interaction between another user, versus again here where you could be walking or driving or biking or rolling through here, and somebody could come from any side, right? So that's fundamentally what we're kind of getting at, is this is about defining interaction between these spaces and the safety for users basically in all of the spaces. This, I think, is maybe the most realistic outcome of what we might expect. Sometimes developments like this, they're built all at once, and when you do a subdivision all at once, you can control more of these aspects, right? You can control more of the access. But Anchorage probably isn't going to do that many more huge subdivisions like this anymore. Or maybe they will, but for now it looks like a lot of what we're dealing with is infill, and for the next few years, a lot of what we're going to do is infill. And so we had to write a code that's sensitive to, doing huge plat subdivisions, but also the smaller infill stuff. And that was another problem with the original site access, is it wasn't very adaptive or usable in those infill circumstances. And this is, of course, maybe the idealized outcome. I think a lot of people, when they imagine what's the ideal of Anchorage, would be something like this. And again, here you have very controlled access to the street, at least for vehicles. You have this nice sidewalk, you have a nice hard curb, and so there's well-defined space of how you get from the house to the sidewalk, and you can walk all the way downtown, basically, well, without ever having to worry about a car, except when you cross the street. You have street parking, you have curb space. This is, I think, what a lot of people are thinking about. The reality, though, is most of Anchorage doesn't look like this, and probably won't look like this anytime soon, at least. And so here's another really salient example, I think. So this probably couldn't be built today anyway, but this is what a lot of people are worried about, and this is what site access is really about. Here you have a property, it's near where I live, and you can imagine somebody owns this, maybe they have a few tenants there, and they're like, I don't want to worry about mowing the lawn, I don't want to worry about plowing, like what's the easiest thing to do? You just pave the whole thing. It makes it that much easier. This is easier for the property owner, but it might cause some problems for everybody else. The problem here, of course, is there's no distinction between where the parking lot ends and the street begins, and the whole area basically becomes this sort of wild west of circulation. And so if you're in the street, which is public, you have no idea what's going on here. If you're on that private property, who knows? People could be driving through there because they think it's a street. So what we've come up with through this site access process is to figure out a way to define that better. And so the standards as we've written them aim to do something like this, where you have better definition between what's public and what's private. And so it does show that, yes, you still have all this road space, you still have an access coming from the private property, but we now have a more clearly defined street. So somebody in the street knows what to expect, and somebody on private property knows what to expect. Here's another example, a duplex down in sort of South Anchorage, 40-foot frontage. They've got a big, wide frontage that's all driveway. There's a lot of this in Anchorage, and that's something that we heard that a lot of people don't like that. And so we're thinking, okay, how do we write some code that balances the need or the desire for people to have access like this, but also the desire to use and protect the public street as a public asset? Because when somebody uses 40 foot of frontage of street, they're also dominating 40 foot of curb space, and that's 40 foot of right of way that can't be used for anything else. You can't store any snow there, you can't park a car there. And so it's a way of a private property sort of taking right of way or claiming an exclusive right to that right of way. So what we've come up with, it would allow something like this, where you get a 28-foot driveway width, and then beyond that you have to have some sort of separation, so people cannot drive over it, even if they pave behind it. And that was a big thing too. The previous site access talked a lot about what paving is allowed, what paving isn't allowed, how much of your frontage you can pave, and that a lot of that just seemed pretty unmanageable and really difficult to regulate. And so the more we looked into it, we realized, well, the problem here is about people crossing the property line. It's not necessarily what's on the property. And so this is what we came up with, that as long as you have some sort of permanent separation between that driving area and the street, people can use the driveway, but we've now preserved that much more of the street. So here you get a little bit back here and here, and now this is area that this is still right of way. You're not going to have access coming in and out. There's another version of that, because you could have 28 feet, you could have it in 2 driveways, 2 14 feet, or 2 12 feet, and a little bit extra here and there. But this is sort of the intent. It's limiting that people can't cross their entire property line frontage onto the street. There has to be a limit to it. And it doesn't apply to private streets, so it's only to public right-of-way. So this is an example of a private street, and you'll see here that this, there's a lot of frontage here where it's just sort of completely unfettered feeding into the street, but that's a private street, so that is allowed. But what isn't allowed is for this area to connect to the public right-of-way without some sort of separation. So you'll see a lot of these all over town, and the private street situation is a little bit different. And alleys were a big discussion. And in alleys, we also were thinking about how alleys kind of function differently. They're usually slower, they're a little bit narrower, and it's not such a big deal when you have a bunch of circulation coming and going, because usually all users know that this is a slower space, and it's not an area where you can be racing around and moving this and that. So in alleys, the rules don't apply. You don't have to have that separation, because it's just an alley space is sort of, everybody knows when you're using it. It almost functions more like a long communal driveway than anything else, rather than a street. And the other piece too is, if you look at the number of alleys in Anchorage, most of Anchorage doesn't have alleys, and alleys are not required in subdivision code. And to retrofit the entire city for alleys would be a massive undertaking, would probably require demolishing a lot of houses. So a lot of the standards and a lot of the discussion around site access is about alleys. People love alleys, and I'll say as a planner, alleys are extremely valuable infrastructure. The reality is we just don't have that many of them in Anchorage, and we should focus on them and make the most of them. But they also can't dominate the entire conversation about how to deal with this stuff, because there just aren't that many of them. You'll see on this map, blue is asphalt alleys, red are unpaved alleys. So we have tons of alleys that aren't even paved, and that's something else site access dealt with. How do you, part of this proposal requires alley access, but it requires alley access when the alley is actually usable. There have been cases where there's a platted alley, it shows up on the map, but the slope is like this, and it's just completely infeasible to do it. But the code said, no, you have to take access off of that, or you have to go through the variance process. And people would say that doesn't really make sense. That's not really fair, because there's no way we could have done it anyway, right? So there's some proposals, or there's some language in this proposal to sort of simplify that. But another thing too is we heard from people that said, sometimes it's okay if the alley is not paved. It might be, it might be graveled and it's completely functional, and we want to be able to develop off that, so we can get that alley access without having to go through the whole cost, because building an alley is like building a street. And I know our colleagues from private development and PM&E, they might have some comments on that later. So Brandon and Paul, I encourage you at the end to weigh in on that if you have anything I missed. Another thing the proposal looks at is door orientation, whether Previously it said you have to be able to see the door from the street. This proposal kind of says you have to be able to see the door from where the parking area might be. So something like this, the door, say, I think these are all one building, so this isn't a perfect example, but say these are all separate buildings. This would now allow that, yes, the door can be visible from over there because somebody driving over here or parks over here will be able to see the door from there. And that makes sense. That's a common sense that, yeah, you should always be able to figure out how to get to the building. And that's something we talked with, fire about, because that's a major issue too. We want to make sure that emergency services can get to the addresses and figure out how to get to places. And another big discussion we had throughout the working group is how do we improve conditions for pedestrians? Because we probably can't do it all through zoning. We can't do it through the way a building looks. We have to do it through updates to the design criteria manual, which is sort of the actual design of the streets. The AMAT's Complete Streets project, which is looking at sort of how streets are used and how they're designed. The Municipality of Anchorage's long-range transportation strategy, which was kind of going on at the same time, looking at the values and sort of the policy about how we use our rights-of-way, and the official streets and highways plan update, which is also going on right now. And some of that, the official streets and highways plan update, for example, it's changing the classification of a road. Some roads have this really high classification, and everybody says, we're never going to get that traffic. The neighborhood doesn't want it. It should be changed. And doing that, then you allow a different set of designs that can create that better pedestrian environment. Because, beautiful buildings are fantastic. I love them. But at the end of the day, somebody is probably less likely to walk past a beautiful building if it doesn't have a good sidewalk or it's not a pleasant, quiet walk than if the building is beautiful and there's no sidewalk or pedestrian infrastructure, right? Another piece, and this is was already in code, but it's just reaffirming it, covered visible entrance. So you always have to have that. I think it has to be about 16 square feet, and you'll see that. Window requirement, there was a lot of discussion back and forth about this. What we ended up with is that 15% of a primary frontage should be visual access windows. There was a lot of discussion about should a door count as that, a door with or without windows. We initially had it without windows. We changed that back to a door with windows. And then on sort of non-primary frontages, you have to have 10% be windows. Now I'll go really quickly through the sections of the AOs. This is probably the most boring part of the presentation, but this is, Sue sent the packet around today. It's massive, but this is section by section, and I'm sure we can have more discussion about this, but this will be really quick overview just so everybody has an idea. Section 1 is about variances and administrative variances. It's removing a section that was added through site access, which basically created a new administrative variance process on top of the existing administrative variance process. This goes back to just saying, just do the regular administrative variance process. Section 2 is about some of the sort of bonus features that were created through site access the first time have now been removed. So it's removing those references from other places like R3A and I think, yeah, B1A and B1B. Section 3 is the same. It's just removing those bonuses. We've been trying to move away from bonuses because bonuses set up this situation where it's not totally clear what the regulation is and the expectations aren't clear. Somebody says, oh, I can get this much height or this much allowance, except if there's a bonus and then the bonus system isn't clear and how that transaction works is not always transparent. Section 4 is removing the urban neighborhood development context areas. So that's that map that I showed at the beginning, that's the inside, the outside. This is removing that and it's going to a more universal standard. So there's no longer a distinction between this area versus that area. Now it's just saying this applies everywhere. We're not having those two tables anymore. Section 5 is talking about, this is a reference. So we had something about a shared parking courtyard that was in the original site access. It moved into 2107, and now it's moving to another place. So this is more like a procedural piece. It's just moving, and we'll see it at the very end. I think it ends up in section 8 or 9. Section 6, a lot of this is adding in waivers. So you'll see a number of waivers added in, and a lot of times what we did is we sort of did like a two-part waiver or a three-part waiver. 2 directors have to decide or 3 directors have to decide. And the thinking there was that every department sort of has its main set of priorities and its charges and what it needs to take care of. And if you have multiple directors together, they can sort of balance all those needs, you know? So private development saying, look, we need this for a functional city. PM&E is like, we need this for functional safety. planning says we need this for the livability goals that we have. Those three can come together and figure that out. And I think another thing about waivers is it's obviously not great just to have waivers all the time for everything, but in big code pieces like this, I think I would say personally, having this here now will make it easier. So as we figure out how the code is working or not, this can provide that relief valve so we don't run into situations where we have to do a moratorium on the whole thing. More on chapter 6, section 6, there's a lot of removal of code. So it's removing all those bonus items. And all those items were originally intended that you do one of these items and you get a parking reduction. So once the parking reduction went away, those items became part of a list that you could choose from, a menu. But in essence, a lot of the menu items you just weren't going to do, and so they became things you had to do anyway. So it's moving away from this wide variety of things that produced a lot of complexity to more simplified, saying, these are the 3 or 4 things we think are really important. Everybody has to do them. Section 7 is a new change. It's a difference of landscaping. So when I showed those images before about the 28 feet, the 40 feet to 28 feet, and you have to put up some rocks or trees or shrubs, this is establishing that. And it's basically saying, whenever you have a parking area or parking facility or parking lot, if you exceed the driveway width and you're within 8 feet of the right of way, you have to put some barriers there, just so we can't have unbroken frontage where the houses or a duplex or fourplex or whatever's frontage is just bleeding into the street with this sort of unfettered access. You can only get 28 feet. You get your access at the property line in your driveway, and you can't be having, so there are examples some places in town where you can see that somebody was on a 28-foot driveway, and then they have a paved area that's not the driveway, but they've paved the whole frontage, but that's technically the driveway, and clearly they're just driving over the entire frontage. This would now say, you can't really do that. You have to have some sort of permanent vertical separation or landscaping there. It can't just be grass. It has to be the full landscaping bed, or it can be a rock or a bollard or shrub. Section 8 of the AO is reinstating a lot of what was there before, the alley access stuff. The Title 21 is always, at least the new Title 21 has had alley access requirements for a long time. A lot of our discussions at the working group were figuring out, when do you require it? What happens if the alley isn't improved? What happens if there's some other complication? So we added some waivers there. And recently we also, in the proposed version that we're going to give you again after the original that was submitted in the city view, we have a few more changes on here. For example, the traffic engineer and the municipal engineer can decide together if an alley is improved or not. And then section 9, this is just, it's sort of changing the name. So previously we had the pedestrian-oriented street frontage standards. Now it's just called building frontage standards, because we're really focusing on pedestrian stuff, pedestrian issues. We should focus on that through right-of-way controls, right-of-way management. And this is really just looking at buildings, how buildings look, and how buildings function. Okay. Any questions for anybody? Or Melissa, if you want to make any comments, or maybe Andre, if any other staff, I guess we'll open it up there.
Yeah, I think first, Tyler had a clarification of my clarification earlier. So if we could start with that, Tyler, if you don't mind chiming in.
Hi, everybody. Tyler Robinson with Cook Inlet Housing. I think what Melissa led with was, and Daniel were talking about the site access stuff came into effect at the beginning of 2024, and then the assembly made some actions to sort of delay it until 2025. Subsequent to that, there's been an ordinance to put a pause more broadly in design standards. So all of that aside, as I understand it and as I read the code, the site access, absent any additional action by you all in the assembly, becomes re-effective in November of 2025 this year for any non-residential use, and continues to be paused for residential uses until 2028. In other words, the work that you're doing and that the assembly ultimately will do is really important to get that sort of reset in advance of the first trigger being 2025, but also there's a little bit of a distinction between residential and non-residential. Is that maybe clear, Melissa?
Yeah, and I'm gonna have to read it all again because I'm not sure that it was it was restricted to the residential aspect of things. So I think
It
that's
does,
maybe
it does
something.
read that, it does read that way. So, but yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Great.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And I guess the only other thing that I wanted to add to what the content of the slides was that in the landscape requirements section, all of the current landscape requirements for parking lots remain as is. And most of those apply to parking lots larger than 10 cars or larger. But that is, these new requirements do not change any of those existing requirements.
Yeah, Brandon or Paul or anybody else, I guess, or any commissioners, if you have any questions. Oh, the chair has it. Take it away, Andre.
Yeah, I just want to add for, I guess, the commissioners and everybody really, that even though there was these design moratoriums or the codes were, yeah, there was moratoriums. It sounds like there was 2 different ones. Just so everybody knows, like, I'm trying to rebuild a demolished house in Fairview, and the code, despite the moratoriums, the code, some sections of the code still exist that are preventing me from getting a permit to rebuild this house that takes access from a road rather than the unbuilt alley behind it that doesn't exist. And so I guess I just wanted to A, point out that, and then B, something that the presentation didn't really touch on was that site access kind of makes commercial development in the B3 as we know it today almost illegal. And so this code change fixes that, but we didn't really touch on that in the presentation. So that's been one of my main concerns for Anchorage all along was, if the car store next to me wanted to remodel their building, it would be next to impossible for them to move towards compliance with Title 21. So I just wanted to throw that in there that this is really, really needed, not just for housing, but for commercial construction as well.
Commissioner Pullis, you have a hand up.
Just following up on what Commissioner Spinelli's saying, you're saying the commercial stuff is, you said illegal. I don't think that's what you meant, but it's so hard because it's so tight to meet all those requirements in those districts. Is that kind of what you're saying, Andre?
No, I meant illegal.
Oh, illegal.
So-
Okay.
Well, because the way the code was written that took effect last January, it was saying for commercial developments in the B3, they needed to have the maximum amount was like 50% of the frontage was allowed for vehicle circulation. And if you think about Cars Aurora Village in between Minnesota and Northern Lights, or Northern Lights and Benson and Minnesota, it's got 3 frontages, and all 3 frontages are 100% fronted with vehicle, like either a driveway or a parking lot.
Yep.
So for them to move towards 50%, I just don't even know how they would do it. It would. So that's what I meant by illegal / impossible.
Okay. And then just another real quick question on the overall things right now with a moratorium on these access standards and stuff. What's everybody doing? Do we know? They can do whatever they want, but Andre's still getting harassed about certain things. What are we currently doing? Maybe
Those
that's a
certain things
P&E
that,
question.
yeah, those certain things that Andre's speaking about are not part of what was included in the moratorium. So even though site access is considered a bundle of code in and of itself, it's actually made up of several different sections, and the moratoriums, both of them only addressed certain portions of it. So for those portions that the moratoriums touched on, then yeah, people are pretty much allowed to do whatever they want at this point, but then there's still some things related to alleys, for example, that are in effect.
It just seems interesting if we're going to do this soon and then we're going to wait 3 years to put it back into effect. So, I'll
Well,
stop.
that's a good point. And that is something that I think that the assembly sponsors might consider, is when the effective date of all of this might come into play. Like, do they want to make it effective immediately? Do they want to wait until after the building season this year? Do they want to stick with the moratorium timeline? So I think that'll be a decision that the sponsors will need to make, and then also something that you may be able to provide some feedback to them on as a commission.
Yeah,
Anna
thank you.
may want to weigh in there.
And we have Commissioner Eber had a comment, and then Tyler, and then Anna. But Anna, you can jump ahead if you want.
Yeah, thanks. And I do separately have a question, but yeah, there were other folks in the queue before me. I'll just briefly, well, first I'll say sorry, I was late. I was at the confirmation hearing for our new building official, so I prioritized that. But I'll catch up on the recording later. I'll offer. I don't know what was shared in the beginning. If it would be useful, I am happy, or I'm sure Mr. Boland is, to give an overview of the working group process and kind of where we are coming from in this ordinance and where it started. And then I have a specific question that I wanted to raise, but just in response to what they said, I think that is a question, and that's certainly, part of the role of Planning and Zoning Commission is to be advisory to the Assembly and to look at policy and look at Title 21 with your guys' expertise and experience. And so that is an area that I would also say, please consider, as a commission, making that recommendation. And then in terms of the pause, I just wanted to clarify briefly. So what is paused right now is sections of Title 21, Chapter 7, Residential Design Standards for multifamily housing. There's one small section that relates to other pieces, but that's mostly that. So 5 or more units. And so there's a Venn diagram basically of rules around multifamily housing, and then this site access piece. And I think what Andre said was basically that this code does not just affect housing. And so I think regardless of what the decision is on that other moratorium, this moratorium ends in November 2025. And it does apply to many more things than just that type of housing. So I think there's 2 questions there. What do we do with the multifamily housing piece? And then what happens with all these other types of development that are impacted by these code sections? And that is something that the sponsors are aware of, but we would also love to hear thoughts. So that's just, I really want to put that on the table because we're talking about 2 different things. They do overlap, but there's a lot of implications with how we approach them. And like I said, these codes, if they go back into effect when they were paused, will impact a lot of other types of development. So that other moratorium does not fully impact this piece, if that makes sense. And then, like I said, I'll have a question, but I'll jump out and come back in later.
Commissioner Eber, you had your hand up, and then Tyler.
Yeah, I was just going to comment on what Andre said about the illegal, stuff over like Abbott, but I kind of answered the question for myself, so I'm not even going to ask it anymore. So I'm good.
Tyler.
Yeah, thank you. I think Anna really was touching on the issue. I really caution all of us here to say things like during the moratorium, people can do anything. It's really what happened was the moratorium was related to very specific aesthetic requirements that only pertained to residential development of sometimes greater than 5, sometimes greater than 8 units, which, by the way, is the least produced residential form that we have in this city. And so none of the other standards that apply to all other sort of commercial developments, all other development, landscaping requirements, all the reviews that happen on fire, building separations, all of that stuff still is in effect. So it's really important that you all as the Planning Commission not walk away thinking, even though that doesn't pertain exactly to site access, it's the Wild West out there. It is not. We are simply trying to provide some relief and get a little bit more organized and targeted on what we mean when we say we want some residential design standards. This fix on site access absolutely has to happen because we discovered over and over, Andre's example is there, but we have examples from infill, we have basically anything that's not on an alley would have had trouble meeting these requirements. So thank you for the opportunity to say that. I think it's really important that we know there's a lot of concern in the community. And I do think, groups like you all that are diving into the details are really helpful to sort of assuage some of that fear. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Tyler, actually, and I apologize for the way I phrased that earlier. There are still a significant number of requirements in place. And I second what Tyler just said about what is in place and what is not. So thank you.
Can I just real quick, this is Andre, add on to that? When I was down in Juneau last week and there was a headline about residential design standard moratorium, and legislators were actually asking me if Anchorage abolished its codes completely. Like that was the impression they had. There was no building code, no zoning code. And so that, Tyler, your comments are really good because there is like a lot of confusion about what one ADN headline actually meant.
Commissioner Gardner, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. I guess my question, I don't know if it's something we need to get into now, but it'd be something I'd be curious to hear more about. And this could be addressed to some degree, I'm sure, in the packet that was sent out earlier today that I haven't had a chance to go through. But from my understanding, kind of from the presentation and what we're talking about, is that among other things, and using the working group as an example, I think part of what I understand you went through was identifying, among other things, because of the complications of the way all these provisions interact with each other, a large part of the work, I would think, is figuring out unintended consequences and ways to make sure this all works together. And I assume that as part of that, there are a lot of things that everyone is pretty much on the same page about, and that, that's something that can and should be cleaned up. I assume there are also some areas or concepts that are addressed here that are kind of in a different end of the spectrum, where there might be competing groups or interests as to how something plays out. And I'd be curious to understand as we go through this, kind of what are those areas and what are the different kind of perspectives, to the extent there are portions here that are subjects of controversy, for lack of a more precise word.
That's a great question. Maylise, if it's all right, I'll maybe start and then you can weigh in. Yeah, my understanding of your question is what were the sort of controversial pieces? I think a lot of it is how a building should look, how much driveway a building should get when accessing the street, how much sidewalk should we have, who builds the sidewalk, and how much parking can building have in front of it. And then there's other stuff too, and you'll see in there, when, at least internally, we had a lot of discussion about when do you require sidewalks on cul-de-sacs or on different streets. And PM&E and private development proposed some changes, which we have a new AO that we're going to propose to you all. And at the end of this meeting, or towards the end, maybe in the second half, I'll go over some of the changes with that. But I think almost everything in here, there were a range of perspectives on it. And really, the range was like wanting Anchorage to look the best we can actually possibly imagine it in this really idealized format, and the reality of what we have, what travel patterns are likely to be, and what can actually get things built. So I would say if you're looking for sort of controversy points, it's the percentage of windows, and not controversy, but sort of points where there are strong opinions on either side. The percentage of windows on the facade, how wide the driveway can be, so 28 feet. I would say that Maylise and I thought, well, that's a pretty wide driveway. You could probably go to 24. Actually, Maylise, I won't throw you in on that. I think 28 feet is a pretty wide driveway, but we heard that people like that, we want 28 feet or 40%. And then the other thing too, which is a fairly significant change, is how much of somebody's lot can they pave? Previously, you couldn't pave the whole frontage. But now, because it's tough to require that and regulate that and tie that to a legitimate health safety concern, it's maybe really ugly, but it's hard to say that, like, why? So that's a big one. I guess I'll leave it at that. Maylisa, please weigh in. And also, Paul or Brandon, if you want to weigh in too, please do. Any other staff or anybody else on staff?
Yeah, I think pretty much any piece of this, you're going to find differing opinions on that particular piece. So our job was to try to um, find some middle ground in this working group. And I think that the conversations in the working group were very successful in helping us define what the best outcome for this would be, that we could all live with, whether or not we 100% agreed with the end result in the code itself. But I'd like to, if Anna, we did speak to the working group earlier. We described it. We talked about how many meetings we had. But is there anything else that you wanted to add about the working group process and how we use that to come up with the code, the version of the code that we have now?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to speak to that. But I guess hopefully this doesn't retread the ground you're already on. But so back when we've talked about this pause that's happened, and again, I'll separate that from the design standards moratorium. We were talking about a specific pause of big portions of the site access code. So the portions that were paused, as I understand it, are the things that were went into effect in January of last year, and not the entire section. So we talked about the urban context areas and all those things. So anyway, all that to say, there was a couple of fix-it ordinances that were kind of fiddling around the edges of the problem, and then ultimately that's why we said we need to just pause this whole section in terms of the impacts it's having. But at the time, April 2024, when that happened, the discussion was we need to do better and we need to involve multiple stakeholders in the discussion to get to basically a middle place, a middle ground in terms of balancing what the community wants, which is safe, walkable places, good pedestrian design, all those things, with the reality that that it places constraints on development, and especially with small area sites where there's not a lot of space to get all of the to meet all those requirements. I think there's a math problem to it, right? And so and I can't speak to all of the details of that, but that's why we did what we did. And then we said on the record at the time, we need to have a working group process to really pilot this, and knowing that there had already been a lot of work on this, but that the result of it was something that wasn't workable. So we tried a different process. So it took a fair amount of advocacy and it took a few months to get kind of off the ground, behind the scenes advocacy. But I had approached the mayor's office and with Mr. Boland as far as saying, can we do some kind of expedited process to review these, get folks in a room, help each side understand kind of where the other one's coming from and where those tensions are, and try to find, again, middle ground with code that works. And so that's so we had multiple meetings. We did a couple site visits to really kind of see projects that have already been built and talk through those pieces. But we always knew we were on a strict timeline, because these codes, that moratorium, unless we extend it further, will end in November, or whatever we want to call it, the suspension of those pieces of code. And so that's partly why we were on this expedited timeline as well. And so we had our meetings, and then we're bringing it to planning and zoning, working it through the process. And again, this is something that really took, I think, at least 2, maybe 3 years to go through the first time. It went through extensive process, but as I said, there's practical problems with the product. And so that's where we're trying to, again, balance that need. So that's really what the working group, that's where it came from, why it's here, what it did, and also why it's not another 2-year process, because we are on the time frame, and absent other action. That was actually going to be my question. Maybe I'll turn it back to Melissa. Was just for context, we're not talking about kind of new policy, or really or trying to do something significantly different. We're trying to fix something that's already in the code. And I just want to emphasize that, because that's a different project than looking at, some larger scale kind of policy changes around zoning. This is really, these are policies, but that's the implication of where we are. So anyway, so I can take questions on the process, but I'm going to throw my question back to the planning staff, really. Absent any action on this, really, this is the ordinance that's moving right now. It doesn't mean it's perfect. It can certainly change. But if it's not this, it would need to be something else. And if there is nothing done, what happens in November 2025? Like what would we see if again that pause on these sections is lifted?
Anna, I think that's an excellent question, and I need to look at the design moratorium that just passed as well, because I do believe, and like I said, I need to read this again, but I do believe that the pedestrian frontage standards at least were included in that last design moratorium. And so that would extend all of this through 28. So I'll look into that and I'll confirm. And then to answer your question, as if that were not the case, then I think we would probably be in a similar position to what we were in January of when these came into effect. There'd be a lot of uncertainty about how they apply. And I believe it would probably have a pretty big impact on multifamily and commercial and other types of development around town. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think maybe just to put a fine book, because you kind of mentioned it, but so the you said the designs, again, the residential design standards moratorium that's in place affects multifamily housing. And let's assume, because you kind of had a hypothetical, let's assume that's still the case. What other types of development are also impacted by this code? Is it single family housing? Is it duplexes? Is it fourplexes? You said commercial. I just, again, want to be clear because we're talking about kind of two different spheres that overlap.
Yeah. Well, site access itself, as it's written now, as it exists now, impacts all residential, and I believe it does impact all commercial basic. I'll have to, Anna, I'm sorry, I can't answer that off the top of my head because there have been so many versions and different ways of applying it. So I will look into that, and I will make sure that this group has a clear answer to both the moratorium and what actually applies at this moment and what would come into effect in November.
Okay. Yeah, and maybe that's a request for that to just be part of the presentation when this comes to a hearing, because I think as others said, there's a lot of confusion, and then this is not my work session. I'm just here to listen mostly, but I just think it's really important to understand the implications of not doing anything, because like I said, this is a situation where if it's not this, there needs to be some other action, I think. And so that's what we're putting forward this as the plan A. But just to say, this is not a hypothetical.
Yeah, absolutely. I would second that, despite, my uncertainty about exactly what applies when. If we do not do anything with this, we will still need to do something in the future. So this is the option that we're putting forward right now. But if this doesn't pass, then we will still have the same questions and issues that we had before.
All right, we're right at 1 o'clock. Do people want to take a 5-minute rest or keep going with questions? For my part, the only other thing I'd like to go through fairly quickly is just we sent out the original AO. It went through agency review. We got a bunch of comments back, and from those comments, we proposed a number of changes to the AO. So you, dear commissioners or poor commissioners, you're going to have to deal with a big set of changes on top of that AO. But I want to just go through the table of things to look out. Here's what we recommend changing, and because of this comment. So does everybody want to take a 5-minute break maybe?
Hey, Daniel, can I just say something real quick?
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, this is Paul LaFrance. I'm with Private Development. And first off, thanks for this presentation. I'm still trying to wrap my head around all this, so this was good to help clarify everything. I have to jump off, Daniel. Did you want us to talk specifically about the loosening of the sidewalk requirements? Greg Soule and I worked with Brandon Telford on this a little bit. I don't know if we need to get into it. Just wanted to ask you if you wanted us to discuss that.
That's, I'd say that's a question for the commission, but I don't know that they know exactly what the matter is. So basically what happened is we got comments back from PM&E about suggesting to change the sidewalk requirements for when you have to build a sidewalk in a cul-de-sac. And really it's saying that on lower traffic streets, you know, it's raising the threshold. So instead of, I think it's 300 trips per day to 500 trips per day. If it's below 500 now, you don't have to do a sidewalk, and you only have to do it on one side, except in areas where you're near a park, or you're walking to school, or you're in a transit corridor as defined by what's on the map. Do any commissioners have a question on that? It might be, and Paul, it's my fault for not getting the materials out sooner and familiarizing everybody with it. But I wonder if there are questions, and Paul, you have to leave, I can just bring those back later. But yeah, that's to Commissioner Gardner's question. I think that's one section I would make sure you look at. Let me see if I can find the. It's in 2107-060E, Standards for Pedestrian Facilities. So it's section 6. And again, I know this chart looks like gobbledygook, but that's what we're referring to. Unless commissioners have a question now, Paul, I would say maybe I'll just get back to you if there are any questions when we hear about it later after people have had time for review. But if anybody wants to ask now, I would say by all means, take advantage of it. I'm grateful for both Brandon and Paul coming just to be here on hand to answer any questions. But
okay, and just one other thing, and I'm sure everybody's thought about this, but the driveway width issue is a huge issue for street maintenance and snow storage. So it's a really big one. And the other one about paving an entire yard, it definitely affects infiltration and how much water goes into the storm drain. So I'm sure obvious things, but just wanted to point that out.
yeah, it's good insight. Brandon, did you have anything you wanted to mention?
Yeah, by all means, I'd be happy to go over kind of the sidewalk and the garage offset kind of additions that we recommended. I guess, would you want me to do that, or do you want to do it when we go to a break and come back and do it?
I'll defer to the chair of the Planning and Zoning Commission on this one. Andre, you make the determination.
I haven't heard anyone say they needed a break or seen it in the chat, so we could just keep going unless somebody wants to speak up.
All right, so let's do it. Brandon, do you want me to bring up the version or what you guys were looking at?
That's fine, yeah. I guess just from my perspective, I was not part of the working group that was talking about these changes. Member of staff, and I should introduce myself, Brandon Telford. I'm the engineering manager for project management and engineering. And also, prior to being with PM&E, I was in private development. So I have a background, with the city's private development group, as well as the city's project management and engineering group. And then prior to my employment with the city, I actually did private development design for a consultant. So that's a little bit about my background, but I was a staff member reviewing this as part of the normal routing for the Planning and Zoning Commission. And I noticed 2 areas of code that were being touched by this that were sort of areas that I thought there might be some opportunities to make some changes to address some concerns that we have as staff, not just PM&E, but other departments as well. And one of those is when sidewalks are required to be constructed. And the other one is related to garage offsets, which isn't currently up. So I made some comments to the with ideas that I had, and then got some feedback from private development. So that's been further refined. But the general idea is we're not having as much success getting sidewalks constructed on lower volume streets as we would like to, and it's put staff in a situation where we're kind of opposing variances that are going to the plating board, and kind of knowing that that's variance is likely to get approved, which is not a great position for staff to be in. But it's also, it also affects PM&E and projects as well, because we try to conform to these requirements, and it's very difficult to retrofit streets with sidewalks once driveways are built. And so it adds a lot of complexity and costs and everything to PM&E projects as well. So wanted to propose a tweak to kind of how that's laid out right now. Currently, it's any through street, non-cul-de-sac street requires sidewalks on both sides. And then within cul-de-sacs, anything under 150 trips would not require a sidewalk. And then once you get over 500 trips with a cul-de-sac, once you get over 150 trips with a cul-de-sac, then you would need a sidewalk on one side. And if you get over 500 trips on a cul-de-sac, then you would need a sidewalk on both sides. And so we're proposing a change to that to say any street or cul-de-sac, and typically as with 150 trips being a relatively small number of trips, it's typically going to be cul-de-sacs. But any street or cul-de-sac with less than 150 trips would not require a sidewalk. Once you cross the 150 to 300 trips, it'd be a question of whether or not the street or cul-de-sac is located within a designated school walking boundary or a transit supportive development corridor, or if it's used to act as a park. If any of those things are true, then a sidewalk on one side would be required. If none of those are true, then a sidewalk would not be required for something up to 300 average daily trips. So that's, in a lot of cases, that's going to mean cases where we would have been going to the plating board arguing in favor for a sidewalk because cul-de-sac was over 150 trips. In a lot of cases, we wouldn't be doing that. There wouldn't be a variance required. It simply wouldn't be required to construct a sidewalk. And then similarly, sort of following that logic, once you cross that 300 trip threshold, it's default you're building a sidewalk on one side, and that's the case up until 500 trips. Once you get to 500 trips, then you go back to looking at, are you in a designated school walking boundary, a transit supportive corridor, or are you accessing a park? If any of those are true, then we would move to sidewalks on both sides at 500 trips. If those are not true, you remain just sidewalk on one side until you got to 1,000 trips. Then once you trigger 1,000 trips, that would trigger automatic sidewalks on both sides. So that's kind of how we've laid out what we're proposing. We looked at kind of the trip generation expectations around the number of trips that we were recommending. I can kind of have a cheat sheet handy so I can kind of reference it. But 300 trips, if you're looking at just peak hour trips, you're looking at the peak of the peak hour, you'd be looking at a car about every 2 minutes. At 500 trips, again, peak of the peak hour, you'd be looking at a car about every 1 minute kind of passing. And then 1,000 trips, you'd be getting to about 2 cars every minute passing. So those are kind of part of the rationale for setting the numbers where we set them. Just the potential for conflict is lower at these very, very low volume roads, whether it's 150 or 300 trips. It's still very, very low conflict potential because of the few vehicle trips on the roads. So we feel it's more appropriate for the kind of those roads to be allowed to share kind of pedestrians using the street that the cars are driving in. And then as we start to cross over that 300 threshold, we start to think that it's the sidewalks are more needed, but there's still quite a bit of opportunity to cross at that kind of volume. So if you're on the side of the street that doesn't have sidewalk, then should be relatively easy to cross over. And then when you get up closer to the 500 to 1,000 trips, your crossing opportunities get less and less. And so looking at, opportunities to have sidewalks on both sides. So in addition to the pedestrian component of this, it affects, like I said, it affects the development community in terms of what they're building when they're building new subdivisions. It affects PM&E in terms of our projects where we're trying to come in and rebuild streets and try to conform to code, but also our maintenance, our O&M. They have limited resources for clearing sidewalks and sort of by practice at the moment, generally not clearing sidewalks on local roads, but if at some point we want to move to clearing sidewalks on local roads, the more we build, the more kind of O&M time and materials and everything go into not only clearing the snow, but also, I guess, maintaining it. When, the more sidewalk we build, the more potential there is for sidewalk to fail and us for have to go back and rebuild it. So to some degree, there's a component of this and sort of wanting to lower the overall O&M costs long-term on these developments as well.
Brandon, can I build off what you're saying a little bit?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I know that it looks like, okay, so they want to get rid of sidewalks. They want to get rid of walkability. I think the thing that really strikes me about what Brandon says, the rules say you have to build them, and then every time PM&E goes to fight for them, they get a variance anyway. At UDC or Z, I don't remember which one it is. So we have that kind of difficulty of the aspiration of the regulation, but then the reality of when it comes through, like most times they go away. So we're stuck with that. And I think there's also a larger discussion all over the muni at this point about what is actually walkability and how are we going to get to it? Are we going to get a fully built out sidewalk network like we want? Maybe, maybe not. Honestly, we all know that with costs the way they are, maintenance costs, everything, we might not get to that. So then the question is, well, how do you achieve the same goal without building out that network? Maybe it means using existing right-of-way and designing it a little differently, or making it more inclusive for all users. And I go, that's not a satisfying answer. People are not going to like to hear that, but it is thinking about maybe walkability doesn't just mean sidewalks on both sides. Maybe walkability means streets where people feel more comfortable using them, and then we can get the most of plowing just one street that's slower and has more cars on it, rather than plowing one fast street and two sidewalks. So, and Melissa or Brandon, let me know if I'm mischaracterizing that. But I think that's the larger context where we realize, like, Anchorage we can't afford any of this. We don't have a built-out sidewalk network. We really want to get to a different mode share, more walkability. The way things look now, it's probably that we might just have to use what we have and redesign what we have so that it's more kind of Woonerfy stuff, like, those walking streets, rather than always separated infrastructure where this is pedestrian space, this is or driving space. More of like, this is space we all have to share, and we all have to behave a little bit differently in that space.
Yeah,
Daniel,
definitely.
Dan, do you have sorry, this is Andre. Daniel, do you have a picture of that sidewalk that got built that was just a lone sidewalk in the middle of nowhere out off Old Seward that kind of builds on this conversation?
Yeah, I'll bring that one up. I mean, that gets into a larger question of if you require sidewalks to be built piece by piece by piece, it will take 6,000 years for the network to get built out. The alternative is you say, let's build where we want, but then the public sector needs to focus on that, and then you have to make really concrete decisions. Or you have to hope that one area redevelops all at once and they bear that entire cost of redeveloping. And that's a much bigger question than this proposal, but it factored into a lot of those discussions, because everybody agrees this is great, we want walkability, but what if it doesn't walk anywhere? Anyway, I'm going to pull up the example that we found and we'll see. The sidewalk to nowhere.
And I guess while you're doing that, I'll just comment that, we are looking at, changes to the DCM. We've started on a couple of chapters. We haven't tackled chapter 1 yet, but we certainly have ideas. And, sort of, this is part of sort of moving criteria in a direction where walkability is defined beyond just sidewalks, that there's more design criteria and everything related to walkability that goes above and beyond just sidewalks.
Yeah, Commissioner Pullis.
Brandon, did you guys look at like federal standards for when they require sidewalks for residential roadways?
I did
You're on
not
mute.
know.
Oh, there you go. I just Googled it and it says it's, I mean, there's a lot of weird stuff, but it says it starts at like 500 ADT. So just for additional consideration, they've got stuff out there that says sidewalks are required at 500. So
Mhm.
just another piece of info,
Yeah.
something to think about.
Yeah, interesting. I'm not sure how, I guess I'm not familiar with where the feds would be building many or local roads, but that's.
Yeah, they just have a standard out there. And I mean, a lot of times that's what we do. We just look at what everybody else is doing. And I'm not trying to change anything. I'm just putting that out there that there may be a chance we could go even higher with ADTs if somebody prefers that. So I just Googled it, FHWA standards for when sidewalks are required, and it turns up a bunch of stuff. So just something to consider.
Yeah, I looked at NACDO and tried to get some readings off of NACDO, and unfortunately that didn't find anything there, but
it's not always straightforward for sure.
Yeah, 100%.
So, but I did find something. I could send it to if you want, but if you Google it, I bet you find it.
Yeah.
That's not clear info for sure, but yeah, they have something, just so you know.
This is the one that Andre talked about. We did a site visit over here, and you know, you have this beautiful path right here that this building probably had to put in, but the nearest, I mean, I guess you can see that most people are walking on the street anyway. So, and this is a question of offsite, and again, I don't want to impugn this rule or anything like that. It's well-meaning, but at the end of the day, we are kind of, everybody's left scratching their heads like, did we get what we wanted out of this? And I guess while I'm here, I can't resist. An important part of coming to this section of town was looking at, there's a lot over here that was required to take alley access, and because of that, it took access off of the alley instead of the street where everything else was. So this was something we looked at. So here's the property. This is a duplex, or maybe it's a fourplex. And this is the main street, but because they had to take alley access at that time with the code, now you have this sort of odd situation where every other building takes the frontage off of here, and it's, you know, a pretty car-centered street. But this one had to take it off the backside because that's the way the code is written. So this was a really good site visit for us to look at. And again, it's, you know, it's probably fine. It makes it kind of interesting, but it was kind of odd that the code ended up producing this interesting result where this doesn't really fit in with the rest of the street, and it's because of the rules at that time said you have to take access off the other side. So.
And I'll just add on that, just so for everybody to understand, that sidewalk with the fence behind it, when the municipal staff is pushing to follow the code and say we need to require this, and a developer shows up and goes, this guy spent, you know, tens of thousands of dollars to create this pointless, useless thing, and that's where plating boards or the UDC or whoever, commissions made up of people like us, say, oh yeah, we're not going to make somebody do that. And so that's why staff is trying to come up with more realistic rules. I guess I'll just throw that out there so everybody has the context.
Yeah, Andre, I think we saw like 3 of those in the last year, didn't we? Where we were requiring sidewalks to nowhere.
I know there was definitely one out in Eagle River on the Old Glen.
Yeah,
or maybe the Loop Road. The Loop Road.
Yep.
Commissioner Ron.
Thanks, Chair Spinelli. Not to derail this into a conversation about the value of that strip, but you know, I could see a kid rollerblading on that back and forth and back and forth and back and forth out of the public right of way. So, you know, let's make sure that we're keeping open eyes and thinking about, you know, bigger value than what one perspective might provide.
I mean, just to add to that, I think the intent is to have it built while, you know, somebody's in there developing that stretch. I get sidewalks to nowhere because if everybody did it, eventually it would be built. It's just something to definitely consider, Commissioner Ron.
Brandon, I'm going to take facilitator privilege to also mention it. Another way of looking at it is also that maybe in the future that the kid would feel safe rollerblading on the street, I guess, also. I know that this looks like we're like, yeah, get rid of all the sidewalks. We don't want to, it's not without a lot of trepidation that we sort of go down this path, but it's facing the realities of, can we make all rights of way, or can we preserve safety? How do we balance, many users, all rights of way, but also use what we have without dealing with this? So there was a lot of discussion about that. Brandon, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to add with this example, if that weren't built there, and in this case, it doesn't look like grade's an issue, but in a lot of places it is, the developer or the project would not consider the needs of providing grades that will work for a future sidewalk. And so this is what we run into all the time on PMD projects when we try to go into a neighborhood or go onto a collector roadway somewhere and add sidewalks. Is the land use, the development along the road did not consider between the edge of the road and the edge of the property what impacts grades have on any future sidewalk. And so in this case, we know going into this, at least at this particular property, that if we went through and upgraded that road, we could add a sidewalk there. Whereas in a lot of cases, that's not the case, because in order to do that, we'd have significant on-site impacts, or we'd increase driveway grades to an unsafe level. And so there's some value in at least having the development consider what its impacts are going to be to the right of way, not the right of way as it exists today, but the right of way as it's intended to exist in the future.
And one thing I remember we talked about is, well, what if you could, instead of building this sidewalk, you could pay into a fund, and then that fund could be collected and it could produce, then you could build out the whole network. But then we started looking at, well, okay, so would that fund only apply to this area? Or could you potentially pay into the fund and then the sidewalk gets built, somewhere else? Because looking at that, you think, there's probably not, it's not likely that this would get built out. So that could work, but then it becomes difficult about, are you going to have different districts? Or what if you pay into a fund on Darrell Street and then the sidewalk gets built, somewhere up over here or over in West Anchorage? And those, again, were other big questions that we weren't able to address. We just came up with more questions, I guess.
Yeah, and I would say you could look at case law, and that communities have gotten sued for collecting development fees and then spending them in another part of the community. So there's case law to look at related to that as well.
Assemblymember Brawley.
Yeah, thanks. On the topic of sidewalks, yeah, that's another issue where I think there's two things in tension, right? Is the needing to make things feasible to build, but also like what are the trade-offs? So I guess the question specifically for me is, so in my district, especially in areas that were built outside of the old city limits and are on residential streets, we have a lot of strip paved roads, which have driveways close together, very narrow right of way. And it's just really not realistic. Like my street, for example, I don't see how there's ever going to be a sidewalk on it, and in the next 100 years. And I'm in a neighborhood full of those streets. But it also means that those residential streets are actually pretty safe to walk on. I mean, obviously you're watching for cars no matter what, but I see them as differently than walking on Northern Lights or, some of these major roads. So my question is, kind of how do those rules apply, or do the site access, what's proposed, how does it address those kind of strip paved roads? And I'm looking at what we have on screen, kind of looks like another example of those types of roads, just again, knowing that they weren't ever built the way they should have been, maybe, but what does that look like to retrofit parts of the city?
I'll start, and maybe Melissa or Brandon could correct me if I'm wrong, but site access is it's focusing on the private property for the most part. So fortunately, Brandon and his group are updating the design criteria manual, and we're also working on the special streets and highways plan. But I think for a lot of those streets, because I live in Spinard too, and it's the same way, like Lois is just strip, but people walking it all the time. I think how they figure out what that will look like, Brandon, that's probably going to be on you guys, right?
Yeah, and I think the thing that this does do that kind of addresses that for us is, as the sidewalk code sits today, it's not clear who approves the variances and the waivers from it, and that's been kind of a process to work through to kind of figure out how, when we're doing a PM&E process or a project, and we're coming in and we're retrofitting a strip paved road, trying to make improvements to it, and the standard says, on that given road, sidewalk is required on both sides, but we don't have the right of way and the grades don't work. We at one point we were going to the plating board for those variances, and I think the plating board said, please don't come to us for those. So we started doing them for ourselves. So one of the changes that this will address is it defines who approves those variances, who says, it's infeasible to construct a sidewalk, and therefore, the requirement to construct is waived. That will be defined now, whereas currently it's not.
I think sidewalk should be attached to roadway classification too. Roadway classification and AEDT. I mean, that's the big thing. You guys are talking about 300, 500. So back to Commissioner Ron's point, when we're talking about a dead end cul-de-sac with 12 houses on it, that's a lot less big of a deal than, talking about what we're talking about on Darrell Street. And the question is, like, do we keep making the private property owners pay for it? Or do we get rid of that and just say it's part of the street funding later? I'm not talking about getting rid of sidewalks. I think we should kind of make them pay for it. But also I get the point that you're paying for a sidewalk to nowhere that probably won't be completed for at least another 20, 30 years. That's the big thing. But sidewalk requirements should be attached to roadway classification and ADT, I think.
All right, unless anybody has any other questions on this, and by all means keep asking, I'll just go quickly over some of the changes that we'd like you to be mindful of as you wade through. Oh, Tyler has a question. Tyler, go for it.
Yeah, just to clarify, I mean, the example that you show with that little bit of strip pave is not a big deal. To us, what happens, Brandon, is it's not just the sidewalk, right? We're asked to improve and build to half street standards. We're not just building a sidewalk to nowhere, we're building an entire segment of road to nowhere, to the tune that it's costing us the ability to actually build housing in this town. So no one's disputing sort of the end goal, but I do really value this conversation because it's finally getting to I'd gladly do that, but what I'm having to do often is build curb, build an entire crown of a road, deal with drainage problems that I create on the other side of the road. It's often much, much bigger than this one example. Thank you.
Thanks, Tyler. All right, I will bring up, so in the materials, in the staff report, there's a section where we talk about changes we propose on top of the proposal. So this is, we put out all this stuff into City View. It's been out for a couple of weeks. We had the agencies review it. And then we heard a bunch of comments. So we've had a few meetings and we've tried to address some of those comments. So we have edits on top of the proposal. So I would recommend to everyone, as you wade through all this stuff, when you get to this section, which is on page 7, these are the changes that are on top of what's in the original proposal. And that's in Appendix B, which we were just looking at a little bit. You'll see, though, this is sort of the updated version of that. And I tried to put in highlights so you can find where we made some changes from what was published originally. I don't know if it's worth going through the specifics of these without people looking at them. But I would recommend, if you can only do a cursory review, look at just sort of the overview, but then look at these changes also and see if you think they're appropriate. And a lot of these did come from talking with Tyler, talking with other developers, talking with private development and PM&E. So it was good. There were a lot of really good comments, and there was a lot of good clarification stuff that we got out of. And in some ways, we had a lot of flexibility for development, and we went back. In other ways, we added a little bit more flexibility for development. So I won't go through it for risk of putting everybody to sleep unless anybody wants. But I would just, if you have limited time, please do look at this and compare these with the original section and see what you think about that. Other than that, I think we can keep doing questions. Again, no stupid questions, no bad questions. It's a really complicated topic. Or Melissa, if you had any other comments or anybody else. Commissioner Ron.
Thanks, Daniel. Has the department engaged with traffic and their neighborhood greenways initiative?
On site access or in general?
On-site access.
Yeah, Brad was involved, and Zach Hartman was involved. So that was sort of a last minute where initially Brad had the power to make the determination whether an alley was improved or not, and then we had the municipal engineer and the traffic engineer work together. So Brad has seen it, Zach has seen it, and Zach was part of the working group too. So that's why a lot of this, people are going to say, it does look, it's like, wow, fewer sidewalk standards, we got rid of some of the pedestrian frontage standards. And that's why for us, I think it's really important to emphasize that we're doing a ton of other things that are pretty substantial on the right-of-way side. Like the Streets and Highways Plan hasn't been updated in 10 years. And there will be something coming to planning and zoning in, I think, April, that's changing a few functional classifications. One of those is changing the functional classification of fireweed from arterial to collector. Just doing that, all of a sudden, they're able to build a slower street. Another one is Spinard Road. The Spinard Road project hit all these problems where the community says, we want bike lanes, we want wider sidewalks. They say, we can't, it's arterial. We have to meet these standards. So that change is coming, and it doesn't feel connected to this, but I think it is pretty fundamentally connected to this. And the other work that Brandon is doing on the design criteria manual, which sort of feeds into that. So I like to think of the Streets and Highways Plan as sort of the zoning map for roads, and design criteria manual as the sort of zoning chapters for roads. So a lot of this discussion is moving away from trying to get, multimodal outcomes or different mode shares through zoning, and more addressing those directly through right-of-way design and right-of-way management. But Brandon or Melissa, let me know. I mean, Zach was in the working group, but Brad has definitely been involved.
Yeah, they were definitely involved, and this was something that the working group discussed quite a bit. Actually, it was where some of those requirements belonged, whether they belong in Title 21 or if they belong in other regulatory and design criteria references that the municipality uses, like the DCM or the official Streets and Highways Plan. So it was a huge topic of conversation for all of the working group meetings, definitely.
And the best is yet to come with the design criteria manual, because I think we haven't gotten to streets yet. Does anyone else have any? Oh, Brandon, go ahead.
Just a quick question. In the packet of stuff, did you include my memo that I sent you with my comments?
Your memo is included in Appendix D. In the updated memo, the second version that you sent.
Okay.
Can confirm.
Okay.
Hey, you got first billing, Brandon. Good.
Whoa.
Oh, second. Sorry, after Paul.
Yeah. That just explains the rationale behind the changes that PMRD proposed, at least.
Cool. Well, what I would propose is that as you review the materials, if you have any questions, note them down. I don't know exactly how this works, so maybe I don't want to put my foot in my mouth, but if somebody has questions, I think you could send them to us if we share them with everybody, but maybe don't send them to the group. Maybe send them to me and Sue, and then we can sort of try to pre-answer them in advance of the next meeting or the next work session if we have it. But that would be great, so that we can come prepared with your questions. I would also, I guess, an outstanding question for the commission is, are you interested in having a sit down, all of us in the Beluga room, talking this or looking at any other examples prior to the March 3rd regular meeting? And Andre, maybe I'll lean on you to make a determination on that.
Well, that'd really be a question for the other commissioners, because I've been involved since day one. So if the other commissioners start sending a lot of questions, then maybe another work session is in order. But if we don't see any questions, then maybe we just go with the work session the night of the meeting.
So we would schedule it. Should we just notice it and schedule it?
Yes, I'm going to answer that question actually, because I do believe that there will be quite a few more questions after everybody has a chance to review the proposed changes. So Andre and to the rest of the commissioners, does anyone object to us scheduling another work session prior to the next meeting?
I don't object, other than, you know, we were working on scheduling this work session and it was going to be in person, and it was like we were going to have, if we're going to have a work session with 2 to 3 people, I don't know that that's really worth the effort.
Well, as for when I say before the next meeting, I mean the one immediately before the next meeting. So the hour or so before the next planning and zoning commission
Yeah,
meeting.
I thought that was a given, and Daniel was talking about a third work session.
Oh no, just as this the one immediately prior to the March 3rd meeting.
Oh, then yeah,
probably not a
we
bad
should
idea.
have that.
Yep.
Cool.
I think Anna has a comment or a question.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, and I mean, you guys can schedule the work session. I guess the one question would be, is it helpful for the sponsors on the assembly side or the mayor's office to participate in that, you know, in any way beyond just kind of listening? That's just a question to take back. And then, you know, because this is a joint project. And then the other question is, sorry if you can hear it ringing, my phone's ringing. Just reiterating the request to really kind of be clear about what's paused through that other ordinance and action, and then what would go back into effect. I think it sounds like there's confusion about that. So I think just really building that into the presentation is my request. And I think that will be really important in the public hearing itself, but I think maybe it'll feel duplicative, but I think just putting that on the table twice is going to be really helpful. Because I think that's where a lot of the questions are likely to come from. Thanks.
Excellent. Well, thank you all for bearing with us through this massive process. It's been a long journey. Thanks also to Sue and everybody else who got all the materials together. And I appreciate in advance all of you, all the work you're going to do in reading through this stuff. And it's really complicated. Even for us, it's complicated to try and figure out what exactly is going on. So bring your questions, any and all questions. Let's, and then of course you feel discuss as much as you want. We really wanted to have an in-person just so it felt more like we could just hash it all out or just let you know, so there's no uncertainty or anything. So we'll look forward to that. We'll look forward to any questions you send in advance. With that, I don't think I have anything else. Melissa or or Anna, if anybody wants to make any final comments. Holly, thank you to Holly. Holly, please go ahead.
I just want to say that on Monday evening, we a handful of people from the working group, including Melissa, will be presenting as part of the FCC Local Lens series. So this will be the opportunity for to maybe not have such a technical discussion about this topic with members of the community. You can attend if you want.
Great call. Thank you for reminding everybody about that. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. Really appreciate it. Let us know, and we'll see you in about a week for another discussion.
Thanks, Daniel.
Thanks, Daniel. That was a good presentation.
The slides are available on the website. I can send them around. So thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Thank you all.